I welcome you today, Michelle Lerner, lawyer and poet, to the topic, the relation between law and literature.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I'm really happy to be part of this.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Michelle, you said that I am a lawyer and a poet in your study. This combination used to be unique to me. However, over the years, I have met a number of lawyer poets, leading me to believe that there are many legal advocates who either write poetry or could be nudged into doing so. What do you mean by that? Do you think that poetry should be a medium for communicating realities about the legal field?
I do, and I think that anybody who writes or has the capacity to write, either poetry or in some other way creatively, or even journalism, who is in law, should. When I was first working as a lawyer, I worked for over a decade in legal aid, where I worked for an organization that represented very poor women and children in legal matters. And I did write poetry, not that frequently while I was working, but I didn't write about my cases or about what I was seeing in the legal system. I wrote about other things, more personal things. And part of the reason was the work I did seemed very overwhelming emotionally. It seemed draining. It kind of drained my creativity, I felt. Also, legal writing and legal arguments seemed so kind of narrow and dry. They seemed very separate from creative writing. And also, what I saw, the injustices and things that I was dealing with, were happening to other people, to my clients. They were really affecting me, but I wasn't sure how to write about other people without seeming like I was speaking for them. So I didn't. And I kind of thought poetry was my hobby and law was my job, but I started then running into or meeting other lawyers, including other legal aid lawyers doing the same kind of work that I did, who I found out wrote poetry on the side, but they also didn't write about their work. Like I knew an immigration lawyer who was a great immigration lawyer, and she wrote really great poetry, but it was nature poetry. She had this sort of side career as a nature poet, and never wrote about anything that she saw in the immigration system. So when I eventually started writing poetry about my clients' lives and experiences and what I was seeing in the legal system, I realized that it was a powerful medium for sort of condensing and expressing the things about my clients' lives and the legal system and the injustices I was seeing that don't come through in legal writing, where you're constrained to, fitting a situation into a particular statute or regulation or case precedent, that it was a way to sort of communicate how law intersects with life and the realities that people were facing, and things about the legal system that actually need to be changed, that the public needed to know about.
Okay, I see. So you are speaking about writing poetry. So in your case, which one comes first, writing poetry or practicing law?
I started writing poetry when I was 6. So that was a lot before I started practicing law. I decided to go to law school when I was at the end of, in the United States, law school is after college. It's separate from it. And at the end of college, I wanted to figure out a way to do social justice work as a living. And that's why I decided to go to law school. But it was a very long time after I started writing poetry.
So in your poems, like Courage and Homeless in New Jersey, 1987, you advocate your poor and downtrodden clients. What do you aim in your poetry?
I think the biggest thing that I aim for is to communicate to the broader public the realities of my clients' lives and things about the legal system that don't work. Because the things that need to be changed by legislators. The legislators are elected by the general public and influenced by them. And I think there's, when I was doing the work that I did, I would try to talk to people in my life about what I was seeing. And it was very hard to really explain the enormity of the systemic problems I was seeing. And it was kind of shocking to me. I represented women receiving public benefits and in need of shelter, women and children, a lot of disabilities, domestic violence, and yet in the general public, when I would talk to people and also what I would read, there's this stigma about women receiving public benefits, like they're committing fraud, they're lazy, they're undeserving, this sort of horrible public narrative that feeds into the terrible public policies that we have. And I found that no matter what I said in an analytical way or the legal work that I was doing, that it was very hard to actually affect people's perceptions. And so I tried to do that through my poetry. You mentioned Homeless New Jersey, 1987. That poem in specific was really influenced by Charles Reznikoff, who was a poet, over 100 years ago, who he worked for a law digest where they were publishing, published cases, bringing them together into the law digests. I don't know if you guys still use those. That's what we used when I was in law school. Now everything is on the computer here. But he was reading cases over and over, that criminal cases, as he was putting them together, that showed horrible injustices to poor Black American citizens. And he would write poetry by taking the fact sections from those cases and taking language from the fact sections and making a short, condensed poem showing exactly what happened in the case. And then by having one after another, after another, after another, it really very clearly showed the systemic problems. And that's in the Homeless New Jersey, 1987. That's what I tried to do. It was actually from the fact section of the case. And I started trying to I wrote some poems in that fashion, like with actual language and facts taken from complaints that I filed on behalf of clients. However, most of the poetry, other than the first poem, Courage, that I wrote about my clients, was actually published in a newspaper. But other than that, most of my poems have been published individually in literary journals, where I don't think they actually accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish, because in the United States, most people who read literary journals are writers, like poets read poetry journals. Some people who try to keep up with current literature do, but I don't think many legislators are reading them, and they're not hugely popular like a movie would be. I did have one colleague read part of one of my poems at a legislative hearing to legislators one time. But I think what my poetry is so far has ended up accomplishing more is that, for one thing, it kept me going in that kind of work for longer than I otherwise would have been able to, because it was extremely stressful and overwhelming work. And it's helped some of my colleagues to do the same. My first poem about my clients that was published in a newspaper, one of my colleagues read it in the newspaper and told me that it reminded her why she did the work she does every day. And people started reading, other legal aid lawyers started reading the poems at retirement events and things like that, just sort of to support each other. And it sort of reminds me of a quote by Walt Whitman that I like, that is, the attitude of great poets is to cheer up slaves and horrify despots. And I think what I was really aiming at was sort of the latter, the horrifying despots, sort of trying to, shake the people that are creating the policies and get them to change. But I think what I've more accomplished so far is the former, is kind of cheering up and supporting people who are doing the work of fighting the injustices. But I think in a best case scenario, this kind of writing would do both.
Okay. So in the United States, the The relation between law and literature has turned into a movement with the publication of James Boyd White's Legal Imagination in 1973. He believes that law is an art rather than being a science because it is connected with rhetoric, aestheticism, and humanism. Do you think that law is an art or a science?
I think it's either or both, depending on who's practicing it and who's looking at it. I would say that in the beginning, when I was in law school and shortly afterwards, I definitely looked at it as more of a science, and it's probably why I had trouble integrating my creative writing with it. I came to law school as someone who was more of an artist. I was a creative writer, and I had been an anthropology major in college, and I felt like law when I was in law school was very much a science in a way that felt like I was having my brain put into a vice. Like you see a large amount of facts and problems, but only a small number of arguments could be made about them, that everything had to be fit into these little boxes having to do with particular laws and case precedents. But I started to change my opinion when I was in a review session for an exam one day, and another law student who was sitting next to me was complaining about how difficult she found legal thinking. And I agreed with her, but it turned out she meant the opposite. She had been a biology major in college, and she said she was used to having one right answer to everything, and that she felt like law was too ambiguous and there were too many possible answers and arguments. So she felt, as a scientist coming into it, that it was much more of an art, which made me start thinking about it more that way. And also in the first place that I worked, Greater Boston Legal Services, which is a very large, very good legal aid organization, I think it was practiced like more of an art. What we couldn't get for clients in individual cases, we turned into class actions or administrative complaints, or if we couldn't get what we needed through the law the way it was written, we would lobby state or federal legislators to change it. We would sometimes go to the media. The whole strategy of seeking justice rather than just doing what we could do within an individual case seemed like more of an art to me. And I think that's what made me start thinking about fitting creative writing into that process as another extension of it.
I see. Okay, in your opinion, what are the similarities between those two seemingly different fields?
One is that I think they're both trying to persuade. Not necessarily. I'm talking about poetry. I think when you get into novels and short stories, there are a lot of different aims that people have that can also be to persuade. Legal writing is seeking to persuade usually a judge or a small number of people of an actual argument. I think poetry is really intended to persuade the reader of a feeling or a point of view, to try to get the reader to feel what the person who is writing the poem felt. Also, I think there is, with poetry and with law, not so much with prose and law, but there's really a focus on word choice, and sometimes a big focus on one particular word that can have multiple meanings. A lot of cases turn on the meaning of one word in a statute, and having to think very carefully about how an argument is worded to make sure that it fits with that. Poetry is, famous for having a lot of attention paid to individual words, even to punctuation, which actually is also true in law. And just kind of the compactness and conciseness, I think that both poetry and legal writing have.
Okay. You've told me before that you didn't attend literary classes at law college, but why there are literary classes that are presented in law schools? Why do you think that there are such classes? What do they add to the law students?
I think that some law students take them because studying law all day is really boring and difficult, and studying literature can be more interesting. But I think that the law professors that offer them probably offer them to some extent to try to help law students keep perspective. I think it's easy to, in law school, to start looking at the law as a closed system and just thinking about what you can do within it instead of realizing that it's part of a larger society and has a real impact on people's lives and comes out of people's lives. And I think that looking at creative writing, especially, I think most of those courses, rather than looking at poetry, look more at novels and short stories about the legal system. But I think it kind of forces students to keep a broader perspective about what it is that they're doing and looking at. And my hope is that it convinces some students that they don't have to keep the two worlds separate, that there's ways of combining and bleeding one into another. I certainly have, started doing that. And I went to law school with someone, Mohsen Hamid, who's now a famous novelist and has written a bunch of the novels that he's written, I think, were really informed by his legal education. So, hopefully some of these classes inspire a new wave of people writing creatively about law in a way that will reach people.
Okay, so you talk about American writers. So in your study, you wrote about Charles Reznikov and Martin Espada. How would you evaluate such lawyer poets?
I think the thing that has been most important to me about both of them and how they've inspired me is their skill at communicating and writing poetry about other people's lives, about their clients. I mean, that's something that I think kept me from writing for a long time because I was afraid of seeming like I was trying to speak for other people or tell their stories, having difficulty figuring out how to convey other people's desperation at the same time as their resilience and not making them look like they have no agency or power. And I think both Martin Espada and Charles Reznikov, in very different ways, are in Martin Espada's case, was in Charles Reznikov's case, really good at doing that. Charles Reznikov, as I said, took these fact sections from published cases and condensed them in a way that seemed like, I'm not positive if in all cases he actually took the exact words from the written cases, but it certainly seemed like it, like he was sort of taking himself out of the picture and his own emotions and just conveying facts in a very concise way. But by repeating them over and over and having a book full of 50 of them, or more, really showing in a very stark way the systemic inequities and problems. And I have written a bunch of poems, take some of them, like the one that you mentioned, taken from actual published cases, but I started actually writing poetry from things that I myself wrote up about my clients. Like I had written a class complaint, administrative complaint to a civil rights office for the agency, the federal agency overseeing public benefits on behalf of disabled women who were being denied benefits or having them taken away because they couldn't meet a work requirement. These were, very poor women with children. Most of the time, the women themselves were disabled or escaping violence, and they were losing benefits because they couldn't work, which seems absurd. And I wrote a class administrative complaint with the fact section about 50 different cases. And I've tried to turn that into a book of poetry similar to Charles Reznikov's. I haven't actually ever finished it or sent it out. But I think Charles Reznikov is absolutely brilliant at doing that. Martin Espada, very different. He was a practicing lawyer, which Charles Reznikov I don't think ever was. And Martin Espada writes more narratively and often inserts himself into the poetry so that it's clear that when he's writing about clients that he was the legal services lawyer and that what he's communicating was sort of through his eyes what his clients were experiencing. And I've also been inspired to write like that. One of the things I think Espada is most brilliant at is taking things that are very absurd or frustrating about the legal system that are hard to explain analytically, and in a very short amount of space through metaphor and poetry, like really conveying the absurdity. And like one of my favorite poems in the world is a poem of his called DSS Dream that I wanted to read, actually. But he was a lawyer, a legal aid lawyer in Massachusetts, the same state where I was first a legal aid lawyer. And I dealt with DSS stands for Department of Social Services, which is the Massachusetts agency responsible for protecting children, sometimes by taking them away from their parents if there's neglect or abuse, but applies extremely different standards to people who are poor versus people who have money. And really, with poor people, they just terrorize people and behave in really arbitrary ways. It would take me days to explain how they do that and what the case is. But there's a very short poem by Martina Spada, which I'll read. DSS Dream. I dreamed the Department of Social Services came to the door and said, "We understand you have a baby, a goat, and a pig living here in a 2-room apartment. This is illegal. We have to take the baby away unless you eat the goat." "The pig's okay?" I asked. "The pig's okay," they said. And I mean, I don't know how well that translates into another language or culture, but I mean, in my house, every time something really absurd happens or the government does something crazy, my spouse or I usually say, "The pig's okay," because that in just a short amount of space, I think that really conveys how arbitrary things are and how little people feel like they can do to control the situation. So I think he's brilliant at that.
Okay. Some of those lawyer poets have rejected their legal profession in favor of a writing career, like Edgar Lee Masters and Archibald MacLeish. Would you do the same if you have had the chance?
Martina Spada also, he's a professor of creative writing now. He doesn't practice anymore. Yeah, at this point, I would. I'm not working at all right now because I'm getting over an illness, but I have really thought seriously about trying to work professionally in writing and teaching instead of going back into law. Because the work I was doing is very soul crushing. And, I mean, I put a lot of years into it, but I think after a while it gets tiring seeing so much injustice and trying to fit it all into what, the scraps that are offered by the laws as they currently are. I would really, if I had the chance, I would really like to focus more on trying to communicate the broader problems to a broader set of people more creatively.
Okay. Finally, do you think that literature and poetry could in any way persuade legislators and affect them to modify and change legal rules?
I think that it can. I don't know how much it's doing so right now in the United States. I think during the Depression here in the 1930s or maybe the 1940s, there was a book. It was mostly photographs with some writing, but a book called How the Other Half Lives that was published with pictures of people living in deep poverty and some narrative. And it really did change laws. It had such an impact. Whether poetry and other kinds of creative writing can, that's my hope. In order for laws to change, legislators' minds have to change. And normally what makes that happen is the people who vote for them, their minds changing and convincing them to change. And I think that it's easier to reach most people with a form of writing or expression that is not as dry and narrow as legal writing. Certainly I think movies and music can reach people here and change their minds. It would be my hope that creative writing can also. As I said, right now in the United States, new creative writing seems to be read by a fairly small subset of people, except for some very popular novels. But there are exceptions. After the terrorist attacks here in 2001, when the World Trade Centers came down, it's where a lot of financial companies were, and a lot of the public discourse about the people who died were about, people who were bankers and lawyers and people who had money and power. And I remember hearing on the radio a poem by Martina Spada called Alabanza that was about the people who worked in the restaurant at the top of one of the World Trade Centers, many of whom were immigrants, many of whom were very low income, and who nobody had been talking about. And this was on public radio. I mean, must have been heard by millions of people. And I think that kind of thing does have an effect. There have also been poetry written read at presidential inaugurations. Maya Angelou read a really amazing poem at Bill Clinton's inauguration that sort of had a different vision of what the United States could be. And I think when poetry reaches that many people in that way, that it can have an effect. And I guess my hope is always that, at some point it will become really popular and have that kind of effect.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have you today. And thank you very much for your enriching the subject.
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me.